It was a cold afternoon when Emily first told us about the cemetery. I remember sitting in the library and trying to finish my homework when she burst in, eyes wide with excitement. "I found it," she said, practically jumping up and down. "Found what?" I asked, but I am not really paying attention. But then she whispered, "The cursed cemetery." Suddenly a chill ran down my spine because I had heard the rumors before, of course. People said that it was haunted, that something terrible happened there long ago. But I had never paid much attention. I mean, who would? Emily was always chasing after strange stories, and Chloe, well, she loved making everything sound more dramatic than it was. "Ben, you should come with us," Emily said and looked at me with bright eyes. "We could make a project out of it. We can investigate, and maybe even discover something new." I hesitated because the idea of exploring an old cemetery in the middle of winter didn't exactly sound fun. But then Chloe spoke up. Her voice was full of excitement. "It is not just any cemetery because it has been abandoned for years, and they say something sleeps beneath the snow." Suddenly I felt uneasy. Chloe had a way of making everything sound a lot scarier than it really was. But there was something in her tone that made me wonder. What was really going on in that cemetery? What was beneath the snow? Jake, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "I am not so sure about this. What if something happens to us?" But even as he said it, I could tell he was curious. He looked out the window at the snow, and his eyes focused on something far away. Maybe he wasn't as sure as he was letting on. Then, Emily tried to convince us, and her voice was filled with academic passion. "We can go there safely. We will be careful, and we just need to find out the truth." Chloe laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. "Truth? What truth, don't you know? It's not just the cemetery that is haunted. It is the land itself." And then, before anyone could say another word, Emily's eyes lit up again. "We leave tomorrow. Who's in?" I didn't know it then, but that decision would change everything, and that's how it all started. The next day, as the blizzard started to build, I found myself packing things I never thought I would need. A flashlight, extra batteries, a warm jacket. Chloe was researching the cemetery online, and she was printing pages of stories and old newspaper clippings because she was practically glowing with excitement, like she was going on a holiday instead of an adventure into the unknown. Jake, on the other hand, helped reluctantly and muttered to himself, "Why are we doing this again?" He wasn't really scared, but I could tell he wasn't exactly excited either. "Don't worry," Emily said, and tried to keep everything positive. "We will stick together. Just a little research trip, and that is all." But even she looked nervous. Every now and then she would glance at the weather forecast on her phone. Snow. More snow. A blizzard heading straight for the cemetery. Suddenly, a news report came on TV. "A series of strange disappearances have occurred near the old cemetery," the reporter said. "Local authorities are warning people to stay away, but there is no sign of what happened to the missing individuals." That's when the tension between Jake and Chloe really grew. Jake was getting more and more upset. "Are you sure about this?" he asked Chloe, and his voice was tight. "What if something happens to us?" Chloe didn't answer because she was too focused on her research, as if nothing could stop her now. "This is it. We have to go." Suddenly, I felt my heart race because the idea of spending hours in the snow, in that empty cemetery, with the news about the disappearances ringing in my ears, made me uneasy. Then, Emily smiled and patted me on the back. "It is going to be fine. You will see." But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. When we reached the cemetery, the storm had turned violent. The snow was falling so heavily that we could barely see where we were going. The wind howled like a living thing and made everything feel colder than it should have been. The cemetery was completely deserted and not a soul was in sight. As we walked through the gate, the air felt heavier, and it was almost like the ground itself was pressing down on us. The graves were old, their headstones cracked and covered in snow. Some of them looked like they had been there for centuries. But what really caught my eye was the silence. It was so silent. No birds, no animals, nothing. Just the wind. Chloe was laughing and her voice was echoing through the empty graveyard. This place is perfect. Can you feel the energy? She said, spinning around in the snow. But she was the only one who seemed to think this was fun. Jake stayed close to Emily and glanced nervously at the graveyard. Are we really doing this? He asked. It feels wrong. Suddenly the temperature dropped. It was like a cold hand was reaching out from the earth. My breath came out in sharp white clouds and my fingers started to go numb despite my gloves. I looked at Emily, but she was staring at something in the distance. What is that? She whispered. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flickering light, and it was coming from one of the graves. A pale and ghostly light, dancing like a flame. But there was no fire. Jake, I said, and my voice was shaky. Do you see that? Jake nodded, and his face was pale. What is that? Before I could answer, I heard a distant and mournful howl. It sounded like something was crying, or maybe it was screaming. Then, Emily's eyes widened. We need to go back, she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. But then, the light flickered again, and someone, moved behind the gravestones. And just like that, the ground beneath us seemed to tremble. Something was waiting. Something was watching. Later, we decided to explore more and started walking through the cemetery, and the snow was crunching under our boots. The wind was so cold, and I could barely feel my fingers anymore. But what was worse than the cold was the feeling that something was wrong, because the place just didn't feel right. It was like the air was thick with something dark. Chloe, as usual, was in her element. She was taking notes and pointing at things, excited about her discoveries. Look at this, she said, and pointed to an old grave with strange symbols carved into the stone. These are ancient runes. This is incredible. It is just some old grave, I muttered, but even I couldn't hide the unease in my voice. As we walked deeper into the cemetery, I noticed more of the same strange symbols on different graves. They didn't make sense because they were old, weathered, but they seemed to be watching us and warning us. Then I turned to Jake. Do you see this? The symbols. They look too perfect. Like someone left them here on purpose. Jake looked around and his brow was furrowed. Yeah, something is not right, he said. His voice was quiet, but it held a note of fear I hadn't heard before. But Chloe didn't notice because she was too busy scribbling in her notebook. This grave, she said, and stepped toward another one. It is different. The inscription says, "The Forgotten One, entombed beneath the snow." This must be the one from the legend. Suddenly I heard a faint sound behind us, a soft scraping like something dragging across the ground. Then my heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Did you hear that? I whispered. Emily was already moving forward, but Chloe was still lost in her excitement, and her eyes were glued to her notes. No time for ghost stories, Emily said. Let's just find out what is really going on here. But as I looked at the grave Chloe was studying, a shiver ran down my spine because it wasn't just a grave. It was something else. Something that wanted to be found. And then, Chloe stepped away from the group. She wandered off and followed a trail in the snow that led behind the old mausoleums. Wait, I called out, but she didn't hear me. I didn't know it yet, but that moment would separate us in ways I couldn't even imagine. I didn't know how long it had been since Chloe wandered off. Maybe only a few minutes, maybe longer. But it didn't matter. The moment she disappeared, everything changed because the air felt colder and thicker. And the wind, it howled like it was alive and angry. I glanced at Emily and Jake. We need to find her, I said, and my voice was shaky. Jake nodded. Let's go. This place is starting to feel like a trap. Then we started looking around the cemetery and called Chloe's name, but there was no answer because the snow was falling harder now, covering our tracks, and the only sound was the wind. Now the graveyard had turned into a maze, and we had no idea where Chloe had gone. "Chloe!" I shouted, and my voice was echoing into the cold. But she didn't answer. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a shadow darting between the graves. "Did you see that?" I asked Jake. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Jake was silent, and his face was pale. "Maybe we should get out of here." Suddenly, I heard something else. A soft and whispering sound, like someone was calling my name. Then my heart skipped a beat because it wasn't Chloe's voice. It was something darker and something older. Then we kept walking, and that's when I saw it. A face was half covered in snow and stared at me from behind a gravestone. At first I thought it was Chloe, but when I looked closer I realized there was something wrong with it. The eyes were too wide, and the skin was too pale. Suddenly I froze. "Emily! Jake!" I shouted. But when I turned to them, they were gone. For a moment I thought I was dreaming, but then the figure moved slowly, and it was almost like it was floating toward me. My legs felt like they were made of stone, but I couldn't move. I was trapped in that moment and caught between fear and disbelief. Then, the face vanished into the snow. But it wasn't gone. It was still there in my mind, and I knew it was following me. It felt like hours before we finally found Chloe. When we did, she was standing by an old stone crypt, and her eyes were wide with shock. "You guys, look at this," she said, and her voice was shaking. Emily and Jake rushed over to her, but I stayed behind because something about the place felt off, like it was pulling me in. As I stepped closer, I saw what Chloe was looking at. A grave was hidden beneath a blanket of snow and half covered by the ancient stone. "I don't like this," I said and took a step back. "This isn't just a grave. This feels wrong." But Chloe, as usual, was undeterred. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the grave from the legend. It is where they buried the curse, and we have to open it." I looked at Jake, but he just shook his head. "We shouldn't be here," he said, and his voice was low. "Something is going to happen." But Chloe was already on her knees, brushing away the snow and revealing a cracked stone slab. "Help me," she urged. "We need to see what's inside." I hesitated, but something in me told me we had to know the truth. With a deep breath, we lifted the stone. Beneath it was a hollow, and inside, there was something. Not a body, but something else. Something that had been waiting and was hidden for so long. As I stared at what was in the grave, I heard it. A loud and terrifying roar, like the ground itself was shaking. Suddenly, the storm grew fiercer, and the air around us felt charged with energy, as if something had awakened from its long slumber. Then the snow began to swirl, faster and faster, until it was impossible to see. And then everything went dark. We had uncovered something we weren't meant to find. Suddenly, I felt like it was colder as we stood together in the middle of the cemetery. The wind howled and sent shivers down my spine. But it wasn't just the cold that made my skin crawl. It was the feeling that someone was watching us. But then, the voice came. It was faint, like a whisper in the wind, but it was there. "Help me." The voice was distorted, like it was coming from far away, but somehow it was so close. Emily gasped. "Did you hear that?" she asked, and her face was pale. "I heard it," Jake said, and his voice was shaky. He had been quiet until now, but his face told me he was scared. "We need to get out of here," I said, and my voice was shaking. "This place is not right." But Chloe wouldn't listen. She stepped forward and looked at the ground where we had uncovered the grave earlier. "It is connected. This is where it all started." I looked around and felt like something was breathing down my neck. "Chloe, let's go!" Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled. It was a low and rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep inside the earth. My heart raced, and I grabbed Chloe's arm and pulled her back. "We need to leave now," I said. But Chloe just stared at the ground, as if she was hearing something I couldn't. Suddenly, the wind picked up, swirling around us, and that's when I saw it. Something moving in the shadows between the gravestones. It was too fast and too dark to make out clearly. "Get inside!" Jake shouted and ran toward the old mausoleum, and we all followed, and our breath was visible in the freezing air. But the moment we stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind us. I turned around, but the mausoleum was empty. But the whispers were louder now, and they were coming from all directions. And then, I felt it. Cold fingers brushing against my skin. I don't know how long we were trapped in that mausoleum, but it felt like hours. The whispers grew louder and more insistent. "Get out! Get out!" The voice echoed in my head and made it hard to think. "We can't stay here," I said, and my voice was trembling. "We need to face whatever's out there." Emily looked at me and said, "Face it? Are you crazy? We need to get help, not fight whatever this is." Chloe was pacing, and she was clearly agitated. "No, we have to end this. It is tied to the grave, the curse. I know it." Then Jake stepped forward and surprised all of us. "Chloe is right. We can't run. We need to stop it here." I could see the fear in their eyes, but there was something else there too, determination. "Okay," I said, and took a deep breath. "We will face it, together." We gathered whatever courage we had left. Chloe, with her knowledge of the cemetery's history, began chanting something under her breath. It sounded ancient, like a language I had never heard before. Then suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and the walls of the mausoleum seemed to close in on us. I could feel it. Something was coming, something big, and something evil. Suddenly the door slammed open, and in the doorway stood a figure, dark, tall, and shadowy. It moved toward us slowly, its eyes glowing red and its mouth was open in a silent scream. Jake pulled out his flashlight and shone it at the figure, but the light flickered and went out. "It is not real," he muttered and tried to convince himself. "This can't be real." But it was real because the figure took another step forward, and that is when I saw it. The thing wasn't a ghost. It was something worse, something alive, twisted, and angry. It reached for us, and suddenly I felt my heart stop. Then, we ran, and every footstep felt like a fight for survival as we sprinted through the snow, desperate to escape the horrors we had just witnessed. My heart raced, and my breath came in ragged gasps. Behind us, I could hear the screeching winds, but I felt something else, something darker and something alive, following us. Jake was the first to reach the gate. He tugged at it, and his hands were shaking, but it wouldn't open. "It is locked," he shouted, and panic rising in his voice. I could hear it too, the haunting whispers growing louder and closing in on us. Jake's face was pale and his eyes were wide with fear. "It is still out there. We haven't escaped." But just as the shadows closed in around us, the gate opened. We didn't question it. We just ran, and we didn't look back. As we reached the safety of the woods, we dared to stop. We collapsed and exhausted, covered in snow and blood and shaking with fear. The storm had stopped, but the air was thick with an unshakable tension, a feeling like the ground beneath us still held a secret. "We made it," Chloe whispered, but there was no relief in her voice. I turned to look at her, and for the first time, I saw the real fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that doesn't leave even when you think you are safe. Emily, her usual skepticism shattered, and said nothing. She stared into the darkness, and her face was pale and hollow. I don't know," she said quietly. "I don't know what happened back there. That thing, it wasn't just a ghost." Jake looked at us, and his eyes were steady but different, changed. He had faced the fear, and somehow he had survived. "We have all changed," he said, and his voice was calm, but filled with a sense of finality. "And that thing, it is not done with us." We all felt it, the unease that still clung to the air around us. Even though we had escaped, the presence of that dark force lingered in our minds. The memories of the graveyard, the whispers and the shadows, they wouldn't fade. The drive back was silent, and no one spoke. The weight of what we had just experienced settled heavily on our shoulders. We had thought we were free, but I knew deep down that the horrors of the frozen grave were not so easily forgotten. Then, the nightmares came for me first. Every night, the same vision of the cemetery, of the shadows, and of that dark figure reaching out for me. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding and convinced that it was still chasing me. Then, Chloe began to cough, harsh and deep coughs that didn't stop. Her face grew pale, and the doctors couldn't find anything wrong. But I saw it, the same way I saw the strange look in Emily's eyes, the doubt and the fear. It was as if the curse had followed us home. As for Jake, he kept to himself more and more. He stopped smiling and stopped talking about the past. Something in him had been lost, and he was never the same again. It didn't take long before I realized we weren't just haunted by memories. We were being watched. The past didn't let go that easily, and deep down, I knew the frozen grave wasn't finished with us. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.